Hello, everybody. Appreciate you joining us today. There are a lot of tips and tricks we can go through, but one of the ones that I love the most is basically just getting to the end where you can prep your chip for your reader. And I'd like to just share that with you today. It's one of my favorites, and it has vastly improved my ability to obtain reads after cleaning up my chips. I'll jump right into it here. There are a lot of methods that can get you into to a point that allows your chip to read. But sometimes the chip or the equipment limits what you can do. There's methods such as a low heat solder paste and using a template. Those come to mind as things that can get you to a good place where your reader can actually make a connection to your chip. But sometimes you have that one area of the chip that just will not clean up, will not let the BGAs connect. So I'd like to show you a little tip and the trick I use to try to get past that. So these are some of the supplies I'm using. You'll notice that they're nothing extraordinary except for maybe the JBC soldering iron. I mean, that's a pretty fancy one, but we all have our irons that we know that work. There's a holder up at the top. You don't have to have that type of holder. It's just something to hold it in place. And you'll notice down at the bottom, there's a paste, and then there's also the Amtech Flux oil. And I prefer the Flux oil myself. I like the tube because it keeps it clean, which is a big problem with this technique. You got to keep things clean. And it doesn't dry out, so I can squeeze a little bit out of the tube without worrying about covering it back up and exposing it to air. All right, and you got a fancy toothbrush down there for you. So here's what we're looking at here. Your chip has kind of been cleaned up. I didn't dive into what it takes to clean the old tin and solder masks and all those things off of your chip. I feel like that could take up the entire 15, 20 minutes. And in an effort to keep this nice and short but informative, I'm just going to concentrate on this one tip for you, and that is preparing for that last bit of retaining instead of the full reballing. So even though I didn't talk about it, just remember that some of these newer chips, they're sensitive to heat. So we do not want to put an iron to them and allow them to get hotter and hotter and hotter. Sometimes we got to put an iron on there and clean it across the surface and let it cool a little bit. And then do another pass of cleaning and let it cool a little bit. Okay, so remember that these newer wafer type chips, they're getting denser. They're just not as robust as they used to be, and they're a little more sensitive to heat. So in this method, what we're going to do here is grab something that's going to hold our chip nice and tight, okay? And then we're going to apply a little bit of Flux paste and or the Flux oil, just something to get on there. It's got to be nice and clean, okay? Don't use something you've had your iron in for the last 2 years and it's full of contaminating solder balls or lead or old residue that you've cleaned off of other chips and stuff like that. If you've got a brand new can, maybe take a little bit of the oil and put it in the lid, and then you can contaminate the lid all you want, but not the main body of the material. So try not to get any of that extra dirt and mess into your Flux oil on top of the chip. Put a generous amount, please. Okay, and then you can use your iron, or you can use any kind of heat source for a quick blast to liquefy the oil. So the idea here is that the oil is actually going to reduce the amount of heat that's going to the chip itself. Okay, so put enough oil on there to cover all of the BGAs. Get all your pinouts covered. Okay, and then make sure your iron has a nice clean solder tip to it. It should be nice and silver. It should be shiny. That way it'll hold the solder ball to you, to the tip. If you find that you can't get a solder ball to adhere to the tip of your iron, it's because you have a little bit of slag or residue on there that's preventing the heat from coming all the way to the surface. So clean it off. Use a wire brush, a wire scratchy or something like that to clean it off. We don't usually recommend using a sponge because even though the steam does a good job, it just fluctuates the heat too much. Okay. So take some solder wire, some low melt solder wire, and create a large ball on the tip of your iron. Some of you may have seen this before. This may be new to some of the others. You'll find that there's a sweet spot between where you can make a large solder ball, and if you make it too large, it just falls off, and you got to either pick it back up or start all over again. But make a sizable solder ball that sticks to the end of the iron, like the lower left one there. Okay, just melting some solder onto an iron. Okay, then you simply take the ball that you've put on the end of your iron and you roll it through, or you paint onto the chip in the area of the BGAs you want to clean up. Okay. Sometimes you got to go over it a few times. Sometimes the ball falls off in the middle of your oil, and you got to clean that up and pick it back up. An important point on this tip is basically only the ball, the solder ball itself, should be touching the chip. Your iron should not be touching the chip. The whole idea of this is to keep heat from. So you paint that ball through there, you'll find that it starts to look shiny, starts to look, you'll see a different colorization as you do this. And the reason I really like this method is sometimes I just have that corner that just will not accept it. And I've cleaned it. I've kind of scraped at it with a nice sharp implement, and I still can't get it to accept some of the solder. Maybe it's a grounding pad and it's got a larger mass that's not letting it heat up enough. I find that doing this method allows me to concentrate on that one corner. Okay. So again, we've just painted it through. Our oil is liquefied by the heat of our iron. Okay. And when we're satisfied that we think we've covered all of our BGAs, remove your heat, remove the solder ball. Okay. Grab your brush and some isopropyl alcohol and clean it. If you use a lesser concentration of isopropyl alcohol and your chip is still warm, you'll find that it creates a residue that is kind of a pain in the butt to deal with. So use the higher concentration of alcohol. 99% is our recommendation. It really does a good job of evaporating quickly and cleaning off residue from the flux oil. They should be nice and uniform and sparkly like diamonds now. You may see that one corner doesn't necessarily shine as well as the others, and maybe that's a problem, maybe that's not. How do we know if it's a problem? If you look at this diagram here on the lower left of your screen, you'll see that's our pinouts. And on our pinouts, we only need so many connections. Not every BGA is needed on there. So if I'm looking at this and I orientate it correctly for pin 1, I can see where my CMD is. I can see where my DAT0 is. And maybe I know DAT0 has to work. I know it needs to be in good condition. So maybe I need to concentrate on cleaning the DAT0 and redoing this method so that it gets into just that area of the DAT0. If it's up in the upper right-hand corner, maybe I don't care. The only reason I would care is if it doesn't want to sit in my reader correctly. If I have one edge up in the corner where my RAM connections are, where the fingers are in this diagram or this picture, then that will keep that one area raised. And so then it doesn't sit nicely in my reader. So make sure you work on those outer edges. They need to be squared off. They need to be cleaned. And that'll allow you to sit properly in the reader. Okay. So then I have a video that brings this all together. Okay. And let me start that video here. Oh, here we go with the video. So I tried really hard to make my own video here, but I couldn't get a camera that would hold still, and my cell phone just wanted to focus on the wrong things. So I'm using one of our training videos here. So he's got a large amount of flux oil, and he's going to spread it around, and he's going to spread it around some more. Maybe a little bit more. Sorry, it just drives me crazy that we sit here for so long watching him spread. All right, so then we're just liquefying it. We're not putting the iron on the chip itself. We're just getting that oil to melt a little bit for us, okay? Here comes our iron with a nice shiny silvery tip, adding a little wire, putting our glasses on so we can see that it's there. Now we're just gonna paint it through. You can instantly see some changes, correct? This is a video from Bob Elder, person who taught me all this stuff, taught a lot of us all this stuff. So he's concentrating on getting it into the BGAs. Notice he's not going around the outer edges. Just concentrate on those BGAs. Nice large solder ball. The iron is not touching the chip again. Okay. Put your iron away. Normally I would dab it with some lint-free paper towels at this point. He's going straight to the alcohol and a fancy toothbrush. And we got sparkly diamonds. This was not a new chip when we started. This was a chip that was a full chip off. Okay. And that is pretty much my presentation. I'd love to hear some questions if you have any. Looks like we just have some people signing on. Sorry that. Let me see what the chat has. So again, I did want to make my own videos and show you a few more little points in there, but I just couldn't get my camera system to work or use a laptop camera to get in quick enough. So if there's any questions, please. I try to keep this nice and short for you.
Got one from Aaron. Any tips on retinning the solder tips?
Yeah, sometimes that's half the battle, right? One of my favorite methods is just to scratch it up a little bit, but sometimes you can actually go in and use the oil on the tip of your iron, and that will kind of steam it off for you. I don't like a tip refresher because that acid will remove the oxide coating on the outside. If you've got a quality iron, that is not it's not good. It'll ruin your iron tip. Okay. If you don't have a quality iron and it doesn't have an oxide on the outside of it or on the tip of it, you're not going to do any harm. You can use a tip refresher, but sometimes that's half the battle. And then before you put it away, if it's still silver, put a coating of solder over it and let it cool with that coating. It's almost like a cap on there. And now it's not oxidizing as it sits and cools.
Josh Brenti asked, how hot do you generally run your iron at for this method?
Good question. So I try to stay as low as I can. But when the solder, I usually keep mine at about 325 Celsius. I try not to go any higher than that. When I'm cleaning off my chips, I try to go as low as I can so that I'm still getting results, so that it's still removing some debris off the top of my chip. And but the iron itself, I try not to go anywhere above 350 at most, but I try to come down a little bit, trying not to add as much heat as I can. Try to keep it cool. So 325 Celsius, everything's in Celsius.
Mm.
Now, there are cold tip-off methods. There are other methods to get to this point where you never even have to use this method because the machinery does it for you. And I see someone mentioning in there they'd love to see some cold chip off. We could probably work on that.
Brian asked, does this method work to eliminate the glue or epoxy?
No, you need to clean that off before you get to this point. If you try to do this with that glue and or epoxy in there, it will simply just compound your mess. It'll make it worse. You need to remove that stuff. And that's where your iron comes in, and you try to, sweep or as I was taught to shovel the material out of your way, like you're shoveling a driveway of snow. For those of us that are familiar, trying to not scratch into the surface of the chip, but just removing all those contaminated areas are. Is the chip ready for chip on at this state? Well, with chip on, I don't see why not. You would have to put on some, it should melt your solder balls. But yeah, I would normally use a stencil if I was trying to do a chip on method, but that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. Low heat solder paste and a stencil would probably suit you better for a chip on method.
Let's see. Yeah, can you show us the polishing technique? Maybe in a future videos I add. Let's see. I'm just wondering if we missed anything. Do you see anything that we missed, Nolan?
I'm scrolling through now. Looks like we had a lot of connection problems, huh?
I know. Yeah, I apologize, that folks. I promised some new software before. I just wanted to try it one more time to see if it was a good connection. So next time we'll try out something new. Yeah, so that seems to be it. I just want to share about the next webinar, and if there's any other questions after that, we can answer them. So just the next webinar I'm really excited for, everyone. It's going to be from Dina Mainville from CipherTrace. And the gist of her presentation is she's just going through one of her cases is that a Canadian citizen purchased a firearm on a dark marketplace in 2015, and an account that was, unbeknownst to him, operated by the Department of Homeland Security in the US. And when the police eventually searched their condo, they found 288 Bitcoin that they surmised to be proceeds of a crime from drug sales on the dark web. So CipherTrace was brought in to complete the forensic analysis, and they're going to go through the case story study in that. So that's very exciting. Please, I'm really looking forward to sharing it. So I'll send out an invite to the link for that for next week. Let's see. Was there? I thought I saw another. Was there another? Okay. Yeah. So if there's no other questions, I think that's it for everyone. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Nolan. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As I said, I'll send out an email with the resources from this presentation. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nolan. Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you.